The rattlesnake struck before anyone could blink, and Clara Whitmore's scream tore through the canyon like a knife through silk, splitting the hot Colorado afternoon wide open. It was the summer of 1874, and the land around Durango was the kind of beautiful that killed you. Sweeping red rock formations stacked like God's own library, sage and juniper pressing in from every side, and a sky so blue and vast it made a person feel both holy and utterly insignificant at the same time. Clara had been told this before she came west. She'd been told about the heat, the rattlesnakes, the men who were more wolf than human, the loneliness that could hollow a woman out like a dried gourd. She had nodded pleasantly and packed her trunks anyway, because Clara Whitmore had never been the type of woman to let a warning do its job. She was 24 years old, educated beyond what most men in the territory thought appropriate, possessed of chestnut hair that refused every bonnet she had ever tried to confine it with, and she was 3 days into a supply run from Durango that was already going badly wrong. Her wagon had thrown a wheel on the second morning, leaving her stranded on a narrow trail that cut through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the San Juan Mountains. She had managed to get the wheel repaired, barely, and with hands that bled in 3 places, but the delay had pushed her further into the backcountry than she had planned to travel. And now the shadows were long, the trail was strange, and she had stepped down from the wagon to check on her mare when the sound hit her. The dry electric rattle was like nothing else on earth. It was a sound that reached directly into the primitive brain and bypassed every rational thought a person had ever harbored. Clara had heard that sound exactly once before, as a child in Missouri, and even then it had frozen her solid. Now, with the snake coiled less than 2 feet from her boot, head pulled back in that hideous S-curve, tongue flicking in the amber light, she felt every nerve in her body go to glass. She should not have moved. She knew she should not have moved. She moved. Her boot scraped the stone and the snake lunged, and the pain that exploded through her left ankle was extraordinary, white and burning and immediate, like someone had driven a hot nail clean through the bone. She stumbled backward against the wagon wheel and looked down at 2 perfect puncture wounds already beating with blood against the pale skin just above her boot collar, and the world tilted sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. "Hello!" she screamed, though the trail was empty, and the canyon walls merely threw her voice back at her, smaller and more frightened with each echo. "Someone, please, help!" The mare tossed her head and stamped, and the snake, its business concluded, uncoiled itself with terrible dignity and slid into the rocks. Clara pressed her back against the wagon and breathed. She had read about rattlesnake bites. She knew what happened next if the venom was left to work. Her ankle was already beginning to throb in that deep architectural way that suggested the swelling had already started beneath the skin. She needed to stay calm. She needed to not run. She needed, above all else, to not be alone in a canyon in the San Juan Mountains with 2 fang marks in her ankle and no idea how far she was from any other living soul. She was actively calculating how many miles she might survive walking when the sound of hooves reached her from the upper trail, not the polite trotting of a settled man on a settled road, but something faster and more decisive, the sound of a horse being ridden by someone who knew this land the way other men knew their own parlors. The rider came around the bend at a canter and pulled up hard when he saw her, the horse throwing dust and small stones as it stopped, and Clara looked up and thought, with the distant clarity of someone already a little frightened out of her right mind, that she had never in her life seen a man quite like this one. He was enormous, not simply tall, though he was certainly that, standing somewhere north of 6 feet when he swung down from his horse with an economy of motion that suggested he had done it 10,000 times. He was built through the chest and shoulders the way a working mountain is built, broad and layered and utterly without apology, his arms bare below rolled sleeves that showed forearms corded with muscle and darkened by months of Colorado sun. His hair was the color of dark walnut, and it fell past his collar in the way of a man who had no one to cut it and did not particularly miss the service, and his jaw was heavy with several days of beard. He wore buckskin breeches and a canvas shirt open at the throat and a rifle in a scabbard on his saddle, and his eyes, when they found her, were the precise gray-green of mountain sage after rain. Those eyes found the snake marks on her ankle in about 3 seconds. "How long ago?" he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. "A minute," Clara said. "Maybe 2. I tried not to move." He was already down on one knee in the dust before she finished speaking, his big hands gentle as he turned her ankle toward the light. He looked at the punctures with the focused attention of a man reading a very important document, and then he looked up at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "This is going to hurt, and you need to let it." "What are you going to—" "My name is Eli Cade," he said, as though introductions were the most natural thing in the world at this particular moment. "I've got a camp about 2 miles up. I can get you there after. Right now I need you to hold still." He produced a knife from his belt, the kind of large, serious knife that Clara would ordinarily have viewed with significant alarm. And before she could process what was happening, he had made 2 shallow cuts across the puncture marks and had his mouth against her ankle, drawing with steady, powerful suction, spitting onto the ground, drawing again. Clara pressed herself against the wagon and gripped the wheel, spoke and focused on breathing. Because between the pain and the surreal intimacy of what was happening, the entire situation had taken on a quality she associated mainly with fever dreams. He worked for several minutes with focused, methodical intensity, spitting each time, checking the wound between each draw, and Clara watched him and tried to hold herself together and noticed, absurdly, that his hands on her leg were the steadiest things she had encountered in days. "Diamondback?" he asked, pausing to spit again. "I think so," Clara said. "Large. It was coiled in the rocks just there." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected, and worked a little longer. Then he sat back on his heels, cleaned his knife on the dust, and looked up at her. "You need to get off that leg. Can you ride pillion?" "I can ride any way necessary," Clara said, with perhaps more dignity than the situation strictly warranted, given that her ankle was throbbing like a bass drum and her hands were shaking. Something moved in his eyes that might, in better light, have been amusement. He stood, and the standing was like watching a mountain come to attention. "Then let's move," he said. "The longer that stays in you, the harder the night gets." That was how Clara Whitmore met Eli Cade in a canyon outside Durango in the summer of 1874, with the snake already gone and the venom already working, and the sky above turning the particular shade of copper that preceded a mountain storm. Eli secured her mare to the back of his own horse, with the practiced ease of a man used to managing multiple animals in rough terrain, then helped Clara up into his saddle with a steady hand at her waist that was businesslike and careful, and somehow, despite everything, deeply reassuring. He mounted behind her and took the reins, and Clara, who had spent her entire adult life maintaining a careful and respectable distance from the various men who had tried to become significant to her, found herself leaning back against a chest that was warm and solid as a pine wall and breathing for the first time in what felt like 20 minutes. He smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and the particular clean scent of someone who lived out of doors, and the arm he kept loosely around her waist as they climbed the trail was steady and unwavering in the way of something built rather than merely grown. "Where are you headed?" he asked from just above her left ear. "Durango," she said. "I came out from there 3 days ago on a supply run for my father's dry goods store. The wagon lost a wheel on the second morning." She paused. "It has not been a distinguished expedition." "Supply run alone?" There was no judgment in it, just the question. "My father is not well," she said. There was no one else. He was quiet for a moment, thinking in that considered way of his. "What's his name, your father?" "Robert Whitmore. He has had the Whitmore Mercantile on Main Street for 8 years. "I know the store," Eli said. "I come through Durango 2-3 times a year for supplies." He paused. "I'm sorry he's not well." The trail climbed steadily through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine, the air cooling perceptibly as they gained elevation, and Clara's ankle continued its bad business beneath her boot. She could feel the swelling now, a tight pressure that was becoming difficult to ignore, and the heat that radiated from it was noticeable even through the leather. "How bad is it going to get?" she asked. Eli considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Diamondback venom is hemotoxic," he said. "It attacks the blood and tissue. You'll get significant swelling, likely some discoloration. Pain, yes, quite a lot of it. Fever is possible, maybe likely. With prompt treatment," he paused. "I got to it fast. That matters considerably." "How do you know all of this?" "I've been in these mountains for 8 years," he said. "You learn what's out here or you don't last." "Have you been bitten yourself?" "Once," he said. 3 years ago. Left hand." He was quiet for a moment. "That was a rough few days." "And you survived it alone?" "More or less." He said it without drama, as though surviving a rattlesnake bite in solitary confinement in the mountains was simply one of the less pleasant items on a long to-do list. Clara found herself looking at the left hand that held the reins, large and scarred and entirely capable looking, and felt something she could not immediately name settle in her chest like a warm stone. His camp materialized out of the trees like something that had been there since the beginning of time. A low, solid cabin built from notched pine logs, its roof covered in a thick layer of turf that had put down actual grass and was doing well by the look of it. There was a lean-to for the horses, a fire ring made of carefully stacked stones, a small smokehouse, and a kitchen garden so organized and productive it stopped Clara short, even in her current condition. "You have tomatoes," she said, somewhat unnecessarily. "And beans and squash," Eli confirmed, swinging down and reaching up to help her. "The growing season is short up here, but if you know the soil, it works." He lifted her down with hands at her waist, effortlessly, as though she weighed nothing, and kept her off the bad ankle with an arm behind her back. "Inside," he said. "I need to get a proper look at that." Inside the cabin was a world unto itself, and Clara, who had spent 3 days sleeping in a wagon, felt the simple solid warmth of it like a physical thing. It was a single room, low-ceilinged and lamplight warm, with a stone fireplace at one end, a wide bunk built into the wall, a table of rough-hewn pine with 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with the accumulated intelligence of a man who lived by his own wits, dried herbs tied in bunches, oilcloth-wrapped provisions, tools in various states of repair, and, unexpectedly, a row of books that Clara counted at 12 before Eli settled her into a chair and she stopped counting. He knelt before her and eased her boot off with extraordinary care, and the ankle that was revealed was already swollen and beginning to show the mottled redness that preceded worse discoloration. He looked at it steadily, touched it in several places, watched Clara's face while he did so with a medical attentiveness that was both thorough and somehow respectful, and then began moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency. He brought a clay pot from the shelf, opened it, and smelled it, nodded. He brought water from a bucket. He brought clean cloth strips that had clearly been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency, which told Clara something significant about the kind of man he was. He washed the wound thoroughly, applied a poultice from the clay pot that was cool and smelled powerfully of herbs, plantain and yarrow, Clara identified from her own limited botanical reading, and wrapped the ankle with care that was almost architectural in its precision. "You should eat something and then sleep," he said, not looking up from the bandage. "The fever will come tonight. It may be considerable. I'll watch it." "You do not need to," Clara began. "You're in my home," Eli said simply, and the simplicity of it foreclosed all argument so completely that Clara found herself with nothing to say, which was an unusual experience. He made food while she sat by the fire, a thick stew from the kind of stores that suggested a man who planned carefully and knew exactly what he needed and what he did not. He spoke very little while he cooked, but the silence was of the inhabitable kind, the kind that does not require filling. When he set the bowl before her and sat down across the table, Clara studied him in the firelight and thought that she had met a great many men in her 24 years, and none of them had looked quite so absolutely and unapologetically themselves as this one. "How long have you been alone up here?" she asked. He looked at the table for a moment. 8 years mostly on my own," he said. "I came out from Virginia originally, after the war." He said it in the way people said things about the war, not with drama, but with a flatness that contained multitudes. "That was a very long time to be alone," Clara said carefully. "I don't mind solitude." He met her eyes. "Mostly." The word mostly hung in the lamplight between them like a small brave flag, and Clara decided, with the part of her brain that had survived the snake bite and the long day and was still functioning as God intended, that she liked this man very considerably. The fever came exactly as he had predicted, and it came hard. By the time the fire had burned to coals and the mountain night had pressed its full cold weight against the cabin walls, Clara was burning from the inside with a heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Eli had given her the bunk without a second's hesitation, rolling his own bedroll to the floor by the fire with the pragmatism of a man for whom floors were entirely adequate, and it was from the floor that he heard her breathing change around midnight. He was up without a sound, and he brought water and a damp cloth and sat on the edge of the bunk with the patience of someone who had done exactly this before and knew that patience was the only tool that worked. He pressed the cloth to her forehead and her neck and spoke in a low, even voice when she was confused, which was often in the early hours. He told her about the mountains, about the particular quality of the silence at 4 a.m. when the animals were still and the stars were so thick overhead they blurred at the edges, about the way snow came in November and transformed the canyon he loved so completely that it became an entirely different place, no less beautiful, just different. Clara, drifting in and out of consciousness with a fever that touched 103 before it began to break, heard his voice as a kind of anchor, a fixed point in a world that had temporarily come loose from its moorings and held on to it. Toward dawn, the fever broke. She came back to herself slowly and completely, the way a tide comes in, and opened her eyes to the gray-blue light of early morning filtering through the one small window, and found Eli Cade asleep in the chair beside the bunk, his huge frame somehow folded into it, head fallen to one side, both hands open in his lap. He had not left her side through the night. Clara watched him sleep for a long moment and felt something move in her chest that was significantly warmer and more complicated than gratitude. She was looking at the books on his shelf when he woke. She had managed to hop to the shelf on one foot with her hand on the wall, which had required some determination, but was, she felt, considerably better than continuing to lie helpless in a man's bed while he watched over her. She had found, among the expected almanacs and hunting guides and a worn Bible, a copy of Charles Dickens's Bleak House and a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that showed the particular wear of a book read many times. "You've read all of these," she said when she heard him move behind her. His voice was rougher with sleep, most of them more than once. He stood and stretched, and the stretch was simply a magnificent thing to witness, every muscle in that extraordinary frame pulling in different directions in the pale morning light. "How do you feel?" "Better," Clara said honestly. "The fever broke, I think, somewhere around 4. My ankle still feels like a small war, but my head is clearer." She turned to look at him. "You sat up all night." He met her eyes without apology or deflection. "You needed watching." "Most men would not have." "I'm not most men," he said it not with pride, but with the simple matter-of-fact quality of someone stating the square footage of a room. Clara smiled at him over Emerson, and something shifted in the cabin the way light shifts when a cloud moves away from the sun. Everything the same, everything suddenly different. He made breakfast, salt pork, cornbread, black coffee that was strong enough to hold a spoon upright, and they ate together at the rough pine table with the morning light coming in at the window. And the conversation moved with the ease of two people who have already been through something significant together and find, on the other side of it, that they like what they see. She learned that his full name was Elias Jonathan Cade, that he was 31 years old, that he had come west after the war with 2 horses, a rifle, and a bad case of the kind of restlessness that no settled life was going to cure. He had trapped through the Rockies for 2 years before finding this particular canyon and deciding, with the instinct he trusted above all other forms of judgment, that here was the place. He had built the cabin himself. He supplied Durango with furs twice a year, brought back what he needed, and went back to the mountain. He had no family living. She told him about her own life, about growing up in St. Louis, about the teacher who had recognized something in her at 14 and lent her books that had changed the entire shape of her understanding, about her father's illness and the mercantile and the way the town of Durango had felt like both a fresh start and a continued confinement. "Do you want to stay there?" Eli asked, pouring more coffee. "In Durango?" Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and thought about it honestly. "I want to be useful," she said finally. "I want to be somewhere that needs what I have to offer." I'm not sure Durango's entirely sure what to make of a woman who reads Emerson and can re-barrel a shotgun. Something warm and certain moved across his face. It's sure what to make of you, he said. It just hasn't decided if it approves yet. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and Eli Cade, who had apparently not heard that sound for quite some time, looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely unambiguous, and Clara felt the warm stone in her chest settle a little deeper. He checked her ankle after breakfast and declared himself cautiously satisfied. The swelling was still significant, and the discoloration had come in fully overnight, a spectacular bruised purple spreading several inches in every direction from the bite marks, which was alarming to look at but indicated, according to Eli, a normal response to a hemotoxic venom load that he believed he had substantially reduced by his early intervention. He reapplied the poultice with fresh herbs from his stores and rewrapped it with the same architectural care as the previous night. You need at minimum 2 more days off this foot, he said. 3 would be better. My father will be worried. Is there someone who can look in on him? Mrs. Aldrich next door, Clara said. She checks on him daily, but he will worry about me if I do not return when expected. Eli looked at the ankle and then up at her, and in the slight furrow of his brow, Clara could see him working through the problem with the same methodical approach he applied to everything. I can ride into Durango today, he said. Let him know you're here and safe. The trail's only 4 hours. I'd be back before dark. You would ride 8 hours round trip in a day for a woman you met yesterday, Clara said. I would ride 8 hours round trip to keep an old man from worrying about his daughter, Eli said simply, and reached for his hat. She watched him ride out from the cabin door, a massive figure on a good horse, moving down the mountain trail with the unhurried confidence of a man who belonged to the land he moved through, and felt something she could not have put a precise name to yet, but that felt very much like the beginning of something important. He was back as promised before the light failed, and he had brought Clara's wagon up the mountain with him, the mare tied to its traces with her own pack and supplies intact. He had also, and this was the detail that undid her rather completely, stopped at the Whitmore Mercantile and spoken with her father and brought back a parcel that he set on the table with a sort of studied casualness. Inside it was her father's handwriting on a folded note, which she read with a clenched throat. The note said, among other things, that Mr. Cade had seemed to him a thoroughly decent man who had spoken about Clara with a care that an old father noticed and appreciated, and that she should take the time she needed to heal, and that Mrs. Aldrich was managing admirably, and that he was proud of her. The parcel also contained, in addition to the note, a clean dress and Clara's own copy of Jane Eyre, which her father had known to send without being asked, and which told Clara that whatever else he was, Robert Whitmore was an extremely perceptive man. Thank you, Clara said when she had read the note twice and folded it again. She looked up at Eli, who was building up the fire with the economical motions of a man entirely comfortable in his own space. He said you spoke well of me. Eli did not turn around immediately. He placed a log and adjusted it, and then he stood and turned and met her eyes with the direct honesty she was already beginning to understand was simply how he was built. I told him the truth, he said, that you were one of the most composed women I'd ever encountered under circumstances that would have reduced most men to weeping in the road. Clara felt the color rise in her face and was grateful for the firelight. You're very forthright, she said. I've found that being otherwise wastes time, he said, and there was a warmth in his eyes when he said it that was unmistakable. They passed the evening as they had passed the morning, in conversation that was already losing the careful quality of 2 strangers navigating new territory and becoming something easier and more direct. Eli pulled the other chair close to the fire, and they read. He from a dog-eared collection of mountain survey reports, which Clara suspected was the closest thing to leisure reading he kept, and she from Jane Eyre, though she found the concentration required for Bronte kept dissolving when she looked across at the firelight on his face. On the second day, her ankle permitted her to move around the cabin with minimal assistance, and she spent the morning discovering the considerable extent to which Eli Cade's domestic arrangements could be improved by a second pair of hands. She organized his herb stores in a way that made their uses immediately legible, noted 3 repairs needed on the cabin's chinking between logs, and located a loose leg on the table that a single wedge of wood would cure permanently. Eli watched these activities from the doorway with an expression that contained equal parts amusement and something rather more complicated. "You've been here 2 days, and you've improved 3 things," he said. "I've identified a dozen," Clara told him serenely, fitting the wooden wedge under the table leg. "I'm pacing myself." He came fully inside and sat down on the bench by the window and looked at her in the direct, considered way that she was beginning to look forward to, with a specificity that was probably worth examining. "Do you fix things the way you find them, or is it an impulse?" he asked. "It's an impulse," she said honestly. "I see something that could be better, and I can't rest until I've tried." She looked up at him. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said. It was a single word, but it had a quality of absolute certainty that made it feel longer. That afternoon, he took her out to the kitchen garden, carrying her to the low stone wall where she could sit with her ankle elevated and still be among the plants in the afternoon light, and she helped him identify which of the bean plants needed staking and which tomatoes were ready to come in, and the work was so easy between them, so natural and unhurried, that Clara found herself looking at the mountains in the late light and feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the precise absence of wanting to be anywhere else. The fever had made her honest in some way she could not entirely explain. Those midnight hours, drifting in and out with Eli's voice as her only fixed point, had stripped away a certain amount of the careful armor she had built up over a careful life, and she found that she could no longer quite be bothered to reassemble it. On the evening of the second day, they were sitting by the fire again, and Eli was telling her about the winter he had spent alone in a blizzard that had lasted 11 days without break. And the telling was matter of fact, but there was something in it, some note beneath the practicalities that told her the solitude had been harder than he let on. "Were you not afraid?" she asked. He thought about it. "Fear is useful when there's something to be done about the thing that's frightening you," he said slowly. "When there isn't, it's just weight. I try not to carry weight I can't do anything with." He paused and looked at the fire. "There are other things that are harder to put down." "Like what?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched in the firelight. "Loneliness," he said finally, with the plainness of a man who had decided honesty was the only currency that mattered. "That one comes and goes how it wants." Clara looked at him across the fire and felt the warm stone in her chest grow heavier and warmer and more insistent. "I know that one," she said. He looked at her then, fully and directly, with those gray-green eyes that held nothing back. "You shouldn't," he said quietly. "You deserve to be surrounded by people who see what you are." The words sat in the cabin like a gift set down very carefully, and Clara felt them in the region of her sternum, behind her ribs, in a place she had not previously identified as being particularly accessible to gifts. "What is it that you think I am?" she asked, and her voice was lower than she intended. Eli leaned forward in the chair, forearms on knees, hands clasped. He considered her with the same focused attention he gave everything that mattered to him, and then he said, "Braver than you know you are, sharper than most people take the time to see, and," he paused, "the kind of person a place becomes better for having." The fire crackled between them, and the mountain night pressed its dark hands against the window glass, and Clara Whitmore, who had arranged her entire adult life around the principle of not being incautious about her heart, felt incaution approaching from a very short distance. "Eli," she said softly. "You should rest your ankle," he said, and stood, and his voice was a little rougher than usual. He offered her his hand to help her to the bunk, and when she took it, and when he held it a moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing it, they both noticed, and neither of them said anything about it, and the not saying had more in it than most conversations Clara had ever had. The third day brought a change in the weather that came the way mountain weather came, fast, total, and entirely indifferent to anyone's plans. Clara woke to a sky that had turned the color of pewter overnight, and by the time Eli had the fire built up and the coffee on, the first rain was already coming down the canyon in horizontal sheets. "You can't ride in this," he said, looking out the window with the calm assessment of a man reading weather the way other men read text. "I was not planning to," Clara said. She poured herself coffee and sat down at the table. Is it going to last? A day, maybe two. These canyon storms run through fast when they're warm. Once the temperature drops. He turned from the window. Your ankle could use the rest anyway. There was a quality to that third day, storm-confined and entirely without agenda, that Clara would remember for years afterward. It was a day without performance, without the subtle shape-shifting that social life required. Eli moved through the cabin attending to things that needed attending to, mending a strap on his pack, sharpening a trap spring, cleaning and oiling the rifle with the reverent thoroughness of a man who understood that properly maintained equipment was the difference between life and otherwise. Clara read and talked and watched him work and felt, to her considerable surprise, not restless or confined, but something very much like peacefully anchored. She told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 16, and whose absence still had a physical quality, like a piece of furniture moved from a room you walked into in the dark. He listened the way he did everything, fully and without interruption, and when she was done, he said simply, "She sounds like she was remarkable," and the simplicity of it was exactly right. He told her about Virginia, about the farm his family had had in the Shenandoah Valley, about his younger brother who had not come home from Chancellorsville. He told it quietly, and without the stiffness men sometimes had when talking about the war, and Clara understood that the 8 years alone in the mountains had done some work on those particular wounds, if not healed them entirely. "Is there nothing you miss?" she asked. "About having a home with people in it?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the lamp on the table between them. "Every day," he said. The rain hammered the roof and ran in sheets off the sod, and outside the horses were warm in the lean-to, and the garden was getting its soaking, and the mountains were doing what the mountains did with perfect, magnificent unconcern. "I keep thinking," Clara said carefully, "that I came out here on a supply run that went wrong in practically every possible way, and somehow I'm sitting in a cabin in the mountains in the middle of a storm feeling more settled than I have in months. Years, possibly." Eli looked at her across the table with that direct, open regard, and there was something in his expression that he was not quite managing to keep entirely neutral. "The mountains do that," he said softly, "if they decide they want you." "Is that what's happening?" Clara said. "The mountains deciding they want me?" He held her gaze for a long beat. "That might not be all that's happening," he said quietly. Clara felt the blood rise in her face and did not look away. "No," she said, "I don't think it is." The storm rained itself out overnight, and the morning that followed was the kind of fresh, washed morning that the mountains produced after weather, the air so clean and cold and resinous that it tasted like drinking from a glacier, the sky an impossible blue above the wet, dark green of the pines. Clara's ankle had continued its recovery with the stubborn industriousness of a body that had been well cared for, and when Eli checked it after breakfast, the swelling had reduced sufficiently that she could put weight on it, carefully, with a stick he had cut and smoothed for her the previous day. They walked in the garden together in the morning light, which was, Clara thought, one of the more quietly extraordinary things she had done in her 24 years. The tomatoes hung heavy and red among their wet leaves, and the beans had benefited extravagantly from the rain, and Eli moved through the rows naming what needed doing with the quiet pleasure of a man for whom a productive garden was a genuine joy. "You love this," Clara said, watching him cup a large tomato in one of those big scarred hands, turning it to check the underside. "This specifically," he said, "or—" He gestured broadly at the mountain, the cabin, the whole sweep of it. "Both," she said. He set the tomato down and straightened and looked at the ridgeline with the expression she was beginning to know, that inward, considering look, as though he were reading something in the mountains that only he could see. "I came up here because I needed something that didn't change," he said. "After the war, everything felt unmoored. People, places, the whole country, and the mountains." He paused. "They changed, but on their own terms. Snow comes, snow goes, the aspens turn, the aspens green again. There's a reliability to it that I needed." Clara stood beside him in the wet garden and thought about the woman she had been 3 days ago, anxious on a broken wagon in a canyon, and the woman she was now, standing in the mountain morning feeling more certain of herself than she had in years. "Do you think you'll stay here always?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the look was careful and direct and carried everything in it. "I thought I would," he said. "I'm currently less certain than I was." Clara held his gaze. "That sounds like a significant shift for a man of established habits." "It is," he said, without looking away. The day that followed had the crystalline quality of something both ordinary and momentous. They harvested together, and Eli taught her to identify which plants had rooted well enough to overwinter and which needed to come in before the first frost. And there was an ease to the teaching and the learning that Clara associated with the very few people in her life with whom real communication had been possible. He did not simplify things because she was a woman, and she did not pretend to know less than she did to make him comfortable, and the result was a conversation that went on for most of the afternoon and covered botany and geography and the history of the various mountain tribes who had traveled this land before any white settler, about whom Eli spoke with a respect and specificity that told Clara he had actually listened and learned rather than merely occupied a landscape. "There are people who think the mountains are empty," he said, pulling a winter squash from its vine with practiced care. That coming out west meant coming somewhere new. But this... He looked around at the canyon walls, the trail worn into the grass by decades of feet that had not been his. This was never empty. It just changed hands, and not always in ways that were right. "No," Clara said quietly, "not at all in ways that were right." He looked at her sideways, and there was something in the look that was appraising and warm at once. "You're not what I expected of a Durango shopkeeper's daughter," he said. "I'm not what most people expect of anything," Clara said. "I gave up trying to manage expectations some time ago." "Good," he said simply, and picked up the squash basket. That evening, Eli made a dinner from the day's harvest that was, given the materials and the single cast iron pot and the fire, genuinely accomplished, and they ate at the small table as the light outside turned from gold to amber to the deep blue of mountain twilight, and the conversation moved from dinner into the kind of territory that two people enter when they have run out of careful ground and must either stand on something real or back away. "Tell me what you want," Eli said. He was looking at her directly, the way he always did, and his voice was quiet but entirely steady. "Not what you think you should want or what makes sense. What do you actually want from your life?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a nightbird called from the pines, and the fire shifted in the grate, and the lamp made the cabin small and warm and entirely the right size. "I want to be useful in ways that feel genuine," she said. "I want to learn things. I want a place that feels like mine." She paused, and the honesty of the moment pressed against her chest from the inside. "I want someone who sees me the way—" She stopped. "The way what?" he asked very quietly. "The way you do," she said. The words were out and in the air, and there was no taking them back, and Clara found that she did not want to. Eli looked at her across the table with those gray-green eyes wide open and entirely undefended, and the thing that moved across his face then was not surprise. She thought he had been expecting something of this shape, but a kind of relief so profound it changed his whole bearing, as though he had been holding something very heavy and had been allowed, finally, to set it down. He pushed back from the table and stood and came around to her side, and he reached down and took her hand in both of his in that careful, deliberate way, standing over her with all his height and breadth and the warmth that came off him like a wall kept in the sun all day. "Clara," he said, and his voice had gone rough. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, and said it in the way that was not an answer to a question he hadn't asked yet, but to the question that was already in everything they had been doing for 3 days. He bent and pressed his lips to her forehead, her temple, the corner of her cheekbone, gentle, careful, reverent in the way of a man who understood that some things required this particular quality of attention, and then to her mouth, and the kiss was warm and slow and entirely certain on both sides, and Clara's hand came up and pressed against his chest over his heart, which was beating with an intensity that matched her own. When they separated, he remained close, his forehead bent to hers, both her hands held in his now, and the lamplight was warm on them both, and outside the mountain was dark and enormous and entirely unbothered by what was happening inside One small, well-built cabin. "I don't know what this looks like yet," he said quietly. "What comes next?" "Neither do I," Clara said, "but I'm not afraid of it." He lifted his head and looked at her with something in his eyes that was extraordinarily luminous. "No," he said, "I didn't think you would be." She needed to go back. That was simply true, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Her father needed her, the mercantile needed managing, and the practical architecture of a life did not reconstruct itself because a woman had fallen in love in a mountain cabin during a snakebite recovery. So on the morning of the fourth day, with her ankle wrapped and the wagon provisioned and the mare rested and fat on mountain grass, Clara Whitmore prepared to go back down to Durango. Eli loaded her wagon with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did, and Clara noticed that among the things he had added to her original supplies were 3 jars of her favorite preserves she hadn't mentioned and a bundle of the dried yarrow and plantain from his shelf in case her ankle needed further attention. She noticed also that he was quieter than usual in the loading of the wagon, and that his jaw had the particular set of a man managing something he did not particularly want to be managing. She stood by the wagon in the morning light and looked at him. "When will you next come through Durango?" she asked. He looked at the mountains and back at her. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that this year I might come through rather more frequently than in previous years." Clara smiled. "How frequently?" He met her eyes. "As frequently as seems right." A pause. "Which, if I'm being honest, might be considerably more frequently than twice a year." "I would find that very acceptable," Clara said. He took her hand for a moment, just held it, his thumb moving over her knuckles, looking down at her with a steadiness that made her feel entirely seen and entirely safe. Then he helped her up to the wagon seat, and he stood back and met her eyes one last time. "Be careful on the trail," he said. "Stay on the main path. Don't stop near rock outcroppings without looking first." "I know about rattlesnakes now," she told him. "You know about this one particular rattlesnake," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "That's a beginning." She laughed and picked up the reins, and he stepped back, and the mare began to move down the mountain trail, and Clara did not look back more than twice, which she felt showed considerable restraint. Durango in the summer of 1874 was a town in the particular state of becoming, rough enough to be real, settled enough to have ambitions, full of people who had come west for reasons ranging from the sublime to the desperate, and were making what they could of it. The main street was a mix of board-front businesses and canvas structures, the smell of horses and sawdust and ambition hanging over everything in about equal measure, and Clara drove back into it on the fourth day with the particular feeling of a woman who has been gone 3 weeks instead of 4 days. Her father was on the porch of their house behind the mercantile when she arrived, thinner than she liked and wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat, and his face when he saw her do something complicated and glad that made Clara climb down fast and hold him for a moment, breathing the familiar smell of him and feeling his arms around her shoulders. "Mr. Cade came through 2 days ago," Robert Whitmore said, when she pulled back to look at him. His eyes, still sharp despite the illness that had been quietly diminishing him for the past year, were taking her in with the careful attentiveness of a father who could read his child. "Tall man. That is a very tall man." "He is," Clara agreed. "He spoke about you," her father said, "the way you speak about something that matters to you." Clara felt the warmth in her chest rise to her face. "He's a good man, Papa." Robert Whitmore studied her for a moment, and then he smiled, a slow, satisfied smile that made him look considerably younger than he had in months. "Yes," he said, "I thought he might be." Life in the mercantile resumed with its ordinary demands, inventory and accounting and the particular social navigation required of a woman who ran a business in a western town, which involved a careful balance of capability and diplomacy that Clara had refined over years. She was good at it, genuinely skilled at the reading of people and the management of relationships that kept a business like this one running, but she felt the limits of it in a way she had not, quite, before going to the mountains. Eli Cade rode into Durango 3 weeks after she had come down from his cabin. Clara was in the back room of the mercantile counting bolts of calico when she heard the bell above the front door. and then Mrs. Aldrich's voice, brighter than usual, and a deeper voice in response, and she stopped counting and set down the bolt and walked to the front room. And there he was. He was wearing cleaner clothes than she had seen him in, which suggested he had made some effort, and he had trimmed his beard, which was still a beard, but one that had been attended to, and the effect of all of that, the effort, visible and quiet, hit Clara in the chest with a directness that rendered Mrs. Aldrich's subsequent commentary entirely inaudible. He looked at Clara across the store, and the look was simple and entirely complete. "Mr. Cade," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. There was warmth deep in his voice underneath the formality of it that Mrs. Aldrich would not catch, but Clara absolutely did. He had come for supplies, legitimately, for the autumn was approaching and his list was real, and he worked through it with Clara's assistance in a way that managed to be both entirely practical and, she thought, one of the better afternoons she had spent. He stayed through the evening, at her father's invitation, for supper, and sat across the table from Robert Whitmore and talked to him with the same direct, unhurried respect he gave everything. And her father, who had sharp opinions about people and very little patience with those who didn't earn them, was at ease in a way Clara had not seen him be with a relative stranger in a long time. After supper, she walked Eli out to his horse in the warm evening, and they stood together on the side street behind the mercantile in the good summer dark. And the conversation was not about anything in particular, and managed somehow to cover everything that mattered. "Your father is a fine man," Eli said. "He is," Clara said. "He's also not as well as he appears at supper." Eli was quiet for a moment. "How long do the doctors give him?" "They don't," Clara said. "They say it depends on the winter. If the winter is hard—" She stopped. He stepped closer to her in the dark, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You're not going to go through that alone," he said quietly. Clara looked up at him. "Eli." "I mean it," he said. "I can't change what the doctor said, but you're not going to go through it alone." The tenderness of it, the plain and uncomplicated certainty of it, made her eyes sting in a way she was entirely unprepared for. "You barely know me," she said, because she felt she should say it. "I know you well enough," he said, and reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with a gentleness that was staggering from hands that size. "I've known people my whole life who I knew much less well." She leaned into the touch, just for a moment, and he let his hand rest against her cheek, and the two of them stood in the good dark of a Durango evening while the town went about its business on the main street and the mountains sat on the horizon like promises. He came back in September, and in October, and in November, he stayed a week and helped her winterize the back section of the mercantile where the stovepipe had been pulling badly for months. He met the other merchants on the street and was characteristically direct and honest with them, and was received with the mixture of respect and wariness that a large, self-sufficient mountain man always generated in a town that was still figuring out its own standards. He sat with Robert Whitmore on the evenings he stayed, and they talked about the war, about Virginia, about Robert's own journey west 15 years earlier. And something genuine and good developed between them, a respect of the kind that can happen between men who have both seen enough of the world to know what matters in it. The winter came hard and early to the San Juans that year, and the town of Durango pulled its coat tighter and went about the business of getting through to spring. Clara's father's health declined as the cold settled in, not dramatically, but with the steady grinding persistence of something that had made up its mind. And there were nights when she sat with him and felt the weight of what was coming with a grief that had no convenient place to land. Eli was there for as much of it as the mountain permitted. He came down when the passes were passable and stayed longer than he had planned, and on the nights when Clara's father was particularly poorly, it was Eli who sat with him while Clara slept, because he knew she would not let herself sleep unless someone else was watching, and because he had developed a genuine care for the old man that had nothing performative about it. One cold January evening, with snow pressing close against the windows and the fire high in the grate, Robert Whitmore looked across the room at Eli Cade, who was sitting with his long legs stretched toward the fire, and Clara's cat asleep on one broad thigh, with the proprietary satisfaction of a cat who has identified the most comfortable lap in the territory, and said, "You love my daughter." Eli looked at him steadily. "Yes, sir," he said. "I do." Have you told her? I'm working on the telling, Eli said, in an order that doesn't get ahead of itself. Robert Whitmore made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a cough. She is not a woman who is easily startled, he said. She can take the telling. I know that, Eli said. It's more a question of doing it right. The old man looked at him with the shrewd, fond eyes of a man who had been watching human nature transact its business for 62 years. Son, he said, there is no wrong way to tell someone you love them. Ushat, as long as you mean it. Eli said nothing for a moment, and then he nodded, with the seriousness of a man taking a genuinely useful instruction. It happened in February, when the snow was deep and the mountains were muffled in white, and the world had the particular enclosed quality of a winter that had been going on for a while, and showed no immediate signs of concluding. Clara came into the front room from the back stockroom to find Eli standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, and something in the quality of his stillness made her stop in the doorway. He turned when he heard her and looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that held nothing back. Come here, he said quietly. She walked to him, and he took both her hands in his the way he had done on the night in the cabin, his big hands entirely enclosing hers, and he looked down at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, all that characteristic steadiness present, but shot through with something tender and slightly vulnerable that moved her profoundly. I have been thinking, he said, about what your father said. Which thing my father said? Clara asked, though her heart was doing something very particular in her chest. That there is no wrong way to tell someone you love them as long as you mean it. He paused. I mean it, Clara. I have meant it for months, probably since that third morning in the cabin when you found the books. I love you. With a clarity that I don't... He paused, visibly working through the words with the care he gave everything. I don't have a way to say how clear it is. It's just the clearest thing I know. Clara looked up at him with eyes that she could feel were absolutely bright and was not remotely apologetic about it. Eli, she said, I love you too. I have for quite some time, and I've been waiting for you to get there. Something broke open in his face, a warm, luminous breaking, like the mountains in the first real light of spring. He pulled her in with those big arms and held her with a careful ferocity that was entirely him, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart under her cheek, and breathed him in, and felt the warm stone in her chest resolve into something bright and entirely unhidden. I'm going to ask you to marry me, he said, into her hair. I haven't yet because I want to do it properly, with a ring, which I am in the process of arranging, and because I wanted to be sure you knew what you were accepting. Life with me is... He paused. It's not a conventional life. Clara pulled back enough to look up at him. Have you ever known me to want a conventional life? She said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A full, genuine, unguarded laugh that she had been waiting months to hear, and lifted her off her feet with the effortless ease of a man for whom she weighed nothing at all, spinning her once in the middle of the snow-lit room, and Clara laughed too, her hands on his shoulders, and outside, the snow fell on Durango with its magnificent, indifferent beauty. Robert Whitmore did not survive the winter. He passed in the last week of February, on a quiet evening when the snowstorm outside was soft rather than brutal. And Clara was there, and Eli was there, and it was as peaceful as these things can be, which is to say it was terribly hard, and also somehow right. He was 62 years old, and had built something good in his time, and he had lived long enough to see his daughter find what she deserved to find, and he knew it, and knowing it had given him a particular calm in his last weeks that Clara was deeply grateful for. Eli carried as much of it as it was possible to carry for another person. He handled every practical matter with quiet efficiency, so that Clara did not have to, and he sat with her in the evenings that followed when she needed to talk, and in the evenings she needed to simply not be alone, and he understood without being told the difference. I keep thinking about all the things he said, she told him one night, sitting by the fire with her head on his shoulder. All the times he told me he was proud of me. I'm glad he said it all. He meant every word of it, Eli said. His arm was around her, steady and unhurried. I know. She was quiet for a moment. He liked you very much, you know. I know, Eli said, and his voice was quieter than usual. I liked him very much, too. The spring came, as springs always come to the mountains, with the gradual, insistent green of it pushing up through the snow from the south, and the aspens leafing out in a shimmer of new yellow-green, and the trails opening as the passes cleared. Clara had taken over the management of the mercantile completely now, and she was, if she was honest, running it better than it had been run under her father's management, because she had a head for numbers and a natural ease with the particular human chemistry of a business that depended on relationships. Eli came down from the mountain in April, when the high passes were just clear enough to travel safely, and he walked into the Whitmore mercantile on a brilliant spring afternoon and set a small cloth parcel on the counter. "I had it made in Santa Fe," he said, and his voice was careful. "I sent the order in October." Clara opened the parcel with hands that were steadier than her heartbeat would have predicted, and inside, on a pad of folded velvet, was a ring of simple, perfect design, a silver band set with a small turquoise stone the color of a mountain sky. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked up at Eli, who was watching her with an expression that was entirely open and entirely his. "I need to say something," he said, and came around the counter to stand before her. He was so tall that she had to tip her head back, and the spring light from the window was on his face, and he looked every inch of what he was, the mountains made into a man, solid and enduring and deeply, genuinely kind. "Clara Whitmore, you came into my life during a rattlesnake bite, and you reorganized my herbs and fixed my table, and you sat by my fire and read Emerson, and you made my cabin feel like a home in 3 days when I'd been trying to do it alone for 8 years. He paused, and his voice had gone rough. "I would like to keep you," he said, "for the rest of my life, and past that if it's possible." Clara looked at him for a moment with the full, luminous intensity of a woman who knows exactly what she is saying yes to and has no reservations whatsoever. "Yes," she said, "with absolutely everything in me. Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, turquoise blue against her skin, and then his hands came up to cup her face, and he kissed her in the middle of the Whitmore mercantile on a brilliant April morning with all the certainty and warmth of a man who has found the one thing he was looking for, and intends to spend the rest of his days not taking it for granted. They were married in June of 1875 in the small church on the eastern edge of Durango, on a morning so beautiful it felt deliberate. The mountains were fully green above the town, and the sky was the particular saturated blue of a Colorado summer, and Clara wore a dress of ivory lawn that she had made herself with the same methodical competence she applied to everything, and she walked down the aisle on a morning full of light and married Elias Jonathan Cade with a feeling of rightness so complete that it registered in her body like the resolution of a chord. The reception was held in the mercantile, which had been cleared and decorated with wildflowers from the mountain meadows by an assortment of townswomen who had become genuinely fond of Clara, and who regarded Eli with the particular awe reserved for men who were so completely what they appeared to be. There was music, and there was dancing, and there was, among the various toasts offered, one by old Mr. Henderson from the saddle shop next door, who said simply that he had known Robert Whitmore for 7 years, and that Robert would have approved of this day more than he could say. And that was the one that made Clara press her face briefly into Eli's shoulder and breathe. Eli's hand at her waist was warm and steady and real. They had talked at length about the question of where they would live, the way two people talk about serious things when they are both sensible and respect each other's considerations. Clara's instinct had been immediate. She wanted the mountain, she wanted the cabin, she wanted the life that was his. But she also had the mercantile, which was her father's legacy and a genuine and functioning business, and the town of Durango, which had people who depended on it. Eli's proposal was characteristically practical and entirely thoughtful. They would keep the mercantile, hiring a manager of real ability to run the day-to-day, and Clara would continue as proprietor and make the decisions while spending most of her time on the mountain. She would come down to Durango monthly, and more frequently if business required it, and Eli would come down with her and use the time for his own supply transactions and the building of relationships in the town that he had previously left entirely untended. It was a solution that honored both of them and what they had built, and Clara loved him a little more for having thought it through so carefully. They found their manager in the form of a young man named Thomas Bright, who had come to Durango the previous autumn with a head for figures and a need for honest work, and who turned out to be so consistently capable that Clara stopped worrying about the mercantile within 6 weeks, which she would not have predicted. The cabin was, with 2 people living in it, and one of them, Clara, in the process of becoming considerably more itself. She did not transform it. She had too much respect for what Eli had built, what it had meant to him and what it still meant, to overwrite it, but she brought things to it that it had needed without knowing it needed them. Curtains at the window that softened the light, an actual iron pot that expanded the range of what could be cooked, a second bookshelf that housed her own books alongside his, a small desk by the window where she kept the mercantile's accounts and wrote the long letters she was discovering she needed to write. She learned the mountain with the focused intentionality she brought to everything, and Eli was the best possible teacher, patient and precise and genuinely delighted by what she learned. He taught her to read weather in the clouds over the canyon walls, to identify animal tracks in the soft earth near the creek, to know which plants were safe and which were not, to understand the rhythms of the high country across the full wheel of the year. She was a dedicated student, which he appreciated, and she learned fast, which he appreciated even more. And the mountains, for their part, appeared to accept her with the straightforward neutrality they applied to everything, which meant, in practice, that they continued to be beautiful and dangerous and occasionally magnificent, and that living among them remained the project of a lifetime. There was one morning in the first autumn of their marriage that Clara would mark later as the moment she understood that she was, fully and finally, home. She had walked out before sunrise to fill the water bucket at the creek, and the world was still dark and cold and absolutely silent, the mountains black shapes against a sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east, and the stars were fading one by one in the growing gray. And she stood at the creek in the cold with her feet in the damp grass and felt the beauty of it move through her like something alive. When she turned to go back, she found Eli standing in the cabin doorway. She had not heard him come out, just watching her, hands loose at his sides, backlit by the lamplight from inside, enormous and quiet, and exactly where he was supposed to be. "Come inside," he said quietly. "Coffee's ready." She walked back to the cabin and he held the door, and she went through it into the warmth and the light. And that was the moment. The first winter of their marriage was a revelation. Clara had known winters in Missouri and winters in Durango, but a mountain winter at elevation was a different order of experience. The snow came deep and stayed, the storms were total and immersive, and the world contracted to the cabin and the lean-to and the distance between them. And everything within that reduced world became extraordinarily vivid and present. She had expected some version of cabin fever, some chafing at the confinement. Instead, she found herself flourishing in it with a completeness that surprised her, because the confinement was with someone she wanted to be with, and the simplicity of a life reduced to fire and food and work and warmth, and Eli's company was something she had not previously known she was capable of finding sufficient. They talked endlessly, in the way of 2 people who are well-matched and genuinely interested in what the other person thinks. They read together by lamplight. They played cards and argued amicably about the rules of games they had each learned differently. She taught him to play chess, which he took to with a strategic thoroughness that she probably should have predicted, and which, 3 months in, meant she won considerably less frequently than she would have wished. He taught her trapping, which she was philosophically ambivalent about but practically adept at, and they agreed on the distinction between taking what the land gave and taking more than the land could sustain, which was a distinction he had held for years, and she had arrived at independently from a different direction. They were happy. Clara understood happiness as a concept in a way that was sufficiently clear to allow her to recognize it with confidence when it was happening. And this was it. Not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of all complication, but the fundamental felt certainty that she was in the right place with the right person doing the right things. The difficulty and the complication were simply the texture of the happiness, not its negation. Eli was, in marriage, exactly what he had been in those first 4 extraordinary days, steady and direct and capable and deeply, genuinely kind, with a particular quality of attention that made Clara feel every day that she was the most interesting person in whatever room or canyon or mountain meadow they happened to be occupying together. He was not a demonstrative man in the public sense, but in private, alone in their cabin, in the mornings and the evenings and the thousand small moments between. He was warm in ways that she had not anticipated from a man who had spent 8 years alone and seemed entirely self-sufficient, and the warmth was the better for being real. In the spring of 1876, Clara discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Eli in the evening when they had come in from the garden and the light was long and gold through the cabin window, and she watched his face when she said it with the intent observation of a woman who wanted to see everything that happened there. What happened was extraordinary. For just a moment, that carefully maintained steadiness cracked entirely open, and what was underneath was something so unguarded and radiant that Clara felt it directly in her sternum. He crossed the room to her in 3 strides and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheeks, and then her mouth. And when he pulled back, there was something in his eyes that she had never quite seen there before, which was a joy so large it had temporarily outrun his capacity to contain it. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling? Is there anything?" "I'm perfectly well," she said, laughing. "I'm not made of glass, Eli." "I know that," he said, and was still holding her face. "I know exactly what you're made of." He rested his forehead against hers. He stopped. "I know," she said softly. He exhaled a long breath and pulled her in and held her, and she felt his heart beating against her cheek, fast and strong, and the afternoon light came through the window and the garden was green outside, and the mountains were there above everything, the way they always were, indifferent and magnificent and hers. They came down to Durango for the birth. Eli had been immovable on this point, not from any doubt about his own capabilities, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what could go wrong and a firm refusal to have anything go wrong. And on a September morning of 1876, in the upstairs room of what had been her father's house and was now hers, Clara gave birth to a son. He was large, which surprised no one who had looked at his father. He had dark hair and a forthright way of expressing his opinions that suggested he was going to be exhausting in the most wonderful possible way. They named him Robert Elias Cade, after the grandfather he would never know, and the naming felt right in the particular way things feel right when they acknowledge what came before, while moving forward anyway. Eli held his son for the first time with an expression on his face that Clara would have given quite a lot to be able to paint, had she been a painter. It was the same luminous, unguarded radiance she had seen when she told him, but steadied now into something more permanent, the look of a man who has just understood, at a new and deeper level, what his life is for. "He's remarkable," Eli said quietly. "He is," Clara said from the pillow, warm and tired and entirely satisfied. "He has your hands." Eli looked at the tiny curled fists and then at his own enormous ones, and the comparison was, admittedly, somewhat relative. But she saw exactly the moment he saw what she meant, and the smile that crossed his face was one of the best she had ever witnessed. Young Robert was 5 months old when they took him up the mountain for the first time, bundled against the November cold in the wrapping that Clara had made from the softest wool she could find, and the cabin received them as it always did, solid and warm and equal to whatever was brought through its door. Clara stood in the doorway with her son in her arms and looked at the mountains in the last light of a cold afternoon and felt the whole sweep of it, her father's careful legacy, the snake-bit afternoon in the canyon, the fire-lit evenings and the fever night and the February morning with the ring and the June wedding, the mountain and the years, the man beside her and the child in her arms. And the feeling that moved through her was not nostalgia, but something better and more present. Gratitude that arrived not as a concept, but as a physical fact. Eli stood behind her, his arm around her and his chin at her temple, looking at the same mountains. "Good," he said quietly, just the word meaning all of it. "Yes," she said. "Very." The years that followed had the quality of something both ongoing and complete. They made Durango trips quarterly, for business, and for the social fabric that Clara understood she needed to keep strong. And the town watched the Cades with the particular interest reserved for people who were doing something slightly outside the expected pattern. A woman who ran her own business and lived on a mountain and clearly answered to no one but herself and her husband, a man who had come in from the wilderness and was, it turned out, entirely capable of being a neighbor and a citizen and a useful member of a community while remaining absolutely, unambiguously himself. Thomas Bright ran the mercantile with the capability Clara had identified in him from the beginning, and she supervised and decided and drove the larger questions of the business from the mountain, making it work in a way that other merchants occasionally found confusing and occasionally found instructive. She expanded the stock based on a careful reading of what the growing town needed and what it would need next, and the Whitmore mercantile grew steadily through the late 1870s into one of the most reliable and well-regarded establishments in Durango. Eli trapped and hunted and tended his garden and knew the mountain in every season, and the life he had been building for 8 years alone became something larger and better with 2 of them, and then 3. And then, in the spring of 1879, 4. The second child was a girl, born in the same room in Durango in an April that was doing its best to be warm and not quite making it yet. She was small where her brother had been large and quieter in her earliest days, and she had Clara's chestnut hair and Eli's gray-green eyes, and the combination was, Clara thought, an entirely unfair amount of beauty in a single infant. They named her Eleanor Rose Cade, and she was from her first moments the kind of person who watches everything with the intent, comprehensive attention of someone who is missing nothing. Robert, who was 2.5 and had opinions about most things, received his sister with the careful wariness of a child who has been told something wonderful is coming and is reserving judgment. He was brought to meet her on the afternoon of her birth, conducted by his father, who held his hand on the stairs with a solemnity that matched the occasion's significance, and he stood by the bed and looked at his sister in his mother's arms for a long, serious time. "Small," he said, which was his verdict. "She will get bigger," Clara assured him. He appeared to consider this. "Like me?" "Exactly like you," Eli said from the doorway, and his voice had the warmth in it that was always there when he watched his children. Robert looked at his sister once more, and then at his father, and then, apparently reaching a satisfactory conclusion, said, "All right," with the air of a man who has reviewed the contract and found it acceptable. Eli made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh, which Clara caught across the room with her eyes, and they shared it. That private, married, 2 people who know each other laugh that was, in its way, as intimate as anything else. The cabin grew a little in those years. Eli added a second room when Eleanor was born, built with the same careful craftsmanship as the original structure, and he added a covered porch at the front where Clara had developed the habit of sitting in the mornings with her coffee, looking at the mountains. The kitchen garden expanded. The bookshelf gained more books. The children grew. Robert was his father's shadow from the moment he could walk, following Eli through the garden and the lean-to and the workshop with a focused attentiveness that made Eli, who had not previously thought of himself as demonstrative, demonstrate more than he had known he contained. He taught his son the mountain with the same patience and precision he had brought to teaching Clara, and watching them together, the enormous, quiet man and the small, serious boy, crouched over a track in the mud or looking at the sky together reading weather, was one of the primary joys of Clara's life. Eleanor was the observant one, the one who watched and stored and retrieved with extraordinary accuracy, who could listen to a story told once and repeat it back 3 weeks later in perfect sequence. She was fascinated by Clara's account books and by the letters Clara wrote, and by the time she was 3, she was demanding to be taught her letters with an intensity that was both charming and impossible to refuse. "She's going to be formidable," Eli said one evening, watching his daughter systematically arrange the letters of the alphabet she was learning into patterns on the hearthstones. "Yes," Clara said, watching too. "She is absolutely going to be formidable." He looked at Clara sideways with the smile that was still, after 5 years of marriage, capable of landing directly in the region of her sternum. "She takes after you," he said. "She takes after both of us," Clara said. "Fortunately." He reached out and took her hand, the way he did, his thumb moving over the silver and turquoise ring she still wore every day, and the 2 of them sat by the fire with their children moving around them, and the mountain outside, and the years of it all behind them, and the years ahead wide open, and, Clara thought, full of every good possibility. There was a particular evening in the summer of 1881 that settled in Clara's memory with the vivid permanence of a painting she had looked at long enough to carry inside her. It was a midsummer evening after a day that had been long in the good way, and they were all outside, the children in the garden, Eli at the fire ring getting the supper together, Clara at the porch step with her mending, and the light was coming down gold and long through the pines, and the mountains above were doing that thing they did in the late light where they changed color by degrees from green to amber to rose to the deep saturated purple of twilight. Robert, who was 5 now, and had his father's build beginning to assert itself in the broad, capable way he moved, was trying to teach Eleanor, who was 2, to identify the different kinds of tracks around the garden fence. Eleanor was tolerating the lesson with the patient condescension of a child who thinks she has already grasped the relevant points, but is willing to let her brother continue for the sake of social harmony. Eli looked up from the fire and caught Clara's eye, and she knew without words that he was seeing exactly what she was seeing, and that the word for it was the same for both of them. Home. This. Everything. Later, when the children were asleep in the new room and the fire was low and the cabin was in that deep mountain quiet that Clara would never entirely get used to in the best way, Eli sat beside her on the wide bunk with his arm around her and his chin in her hair, and she felt the steadiness of him the way she always did, like something geological, like something that predated worry. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. He asked it sometimes, not from insecurity, but from the particular care of a man who had once been very alone and knew the value of what he had. She turned her head to look up at him, the firelight on his face, the gray-green eyes that had looked at her from the beginning with that complete, unhurried attention. 7 years after a rattlesnake in a canyon and a man with a knife and the right instincts at the right moment, she was here, in her own life, with her own hands full of every good thing. "Eli," she said, "I have never been more entirely happy in all my life." He held her a little tighter, and she felt the exhale of him, deep and settled. "Good," he said, and then, very quietly, "Me either." The cabin was warm. The mountains were dark and close and enormous and entirely trustworthy. The children slept in the next room with the deep, absolute sleep of children who have never doubted their safety for a single moment of their lives. Outside, the stars were coming out over the San Juan Mountains, thick and cold and brilliant, the same stars that had shone over this canyon before any of them were born, and would go on shining long after, indifferent and magnificent and, tonight, entirely fitting. Clara Whitmore. Cade had come west to be useful, to find something real, to live at the actual scale of her own capabilities rather than the reduced scale that settled life so often proposed to women of her kind. She had found all of it, and she had found more than all of it, in the form of a very large man with gray-green eyes and a knife, and the steady, unhurried certainty that she was worth watching over. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, the way she had done in the cabin on the night the fever broke, feeling the strong and steady beat of it. "Tell me about the stars," she said. And Eli Cade, mountain man, her husband, the father of her children, her best companion in the full long adventure of her life, stretched his arm out toward the window and the dark beyond it, and began to talk about the constellations the same way he talked about everything, quietly, precisely, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has spent enough time paying attention to the right things that the world has become very clear to him, and there was nowhere on earth that Clara Whitmore would rather have been than right there, listening.